isn't buried, it's coded. Decode the strange. In the circuits of the unknown, where the logic breathes and the data flows, we question what the code has shown and spark the light when no one goes. Clearly learned voices collide.
Be warned, this presentation will be disturbing to some listeners. Viewer discretion advised.
Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to be honest with you right up front. I stared at the stack of research you sent over for this one for a long time before I could even bring myself to open the first tab.
I don't blame you. It's not exactly light reading for a Tuesday afternoon.
No, it's not. We are. We're walking into the dark today. We're tackling a subject that is probably the most difficult, emotionally charged, and frankly frightening topic we could possibly discuss.
Yeah.
We are talking about sexual predation. We're talking about the mechanisms of sexual violence, pedophilia, and the things that go bump in the night, but, you know, the real things.
It is a heavy topic. There's really no getting around that. And I think the hesitation you felt, that's actually the first data point we should probably talk about.
How so? What do you mean by that?
Well, think about where that hesitation comes from. When we hear about sexual offenders, whether it's child sexual abuse or, adult sexual violence, our brains, sort of, they shut down the nuance. We have a binary reaction. We see the offender as a monster, just a morally depraved, evil entity. Or, on the flip side, we see them as sick.
Completely alien.
Yeah, a product of some profound, twisted psychopathology that makes them completely alien to us.
Exactly. It's a defense mechanism, isn't it? If I can label them a monster, then they aren't human. And if they aren't human, I don't have to understand them. I just have to lock them away and protect my tribe. It keeps things simple.
It is simple, and it feels safe. But the stack of research we're looking at today, specifically the papers in the Understanding and Preventing Sexual Predation collection, it really challenges that binary.
It does.
It argues that the monster label is actually, well, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Because it stops us from looking at the why.
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We're going to try to strip away the moral outrage just for the next hour or so to look at the etiology. That's a word that comes up a lot in this research.
The cause, the origin story.
Exactly, because if we don't understand where this behavior comes from, we have absolutely zero chance of preventing it.
Right. So, like, if you treat a fever without knowing if it's caused by a virus or a bacteria, you might actually kill the patient. You have to understand the pathology first. And what the research shows pretty conclusively is that predation isn't a monolithic event. It's not just evil manifesting in a vacuum. The researchers describe it as a probabilistic interplay.
A probabilistic interplay. That sounds like a car crash.
That is actually the perfect analogy. It is a collision. You have the biological hardware, the liability. That's the car itself, the make and model.
Okay.
Then you have the environmental software, the triggers, the road conditions, the weather. And then you have the psychological operating system, the driver's decisions, and the mechanisms they use to justify their driving.
And when all three of those things line up in a specific catastrophic way,
the risk of offending just skyrockets, that perfect storm.
So that's how we're going to break this down. We're going to look at the hardware, the really uncomfortable genetics and brain structure, then the software, the myths, and the realities of the cycle of abuse.
Then the operating system, how grooming actually works, step by step. And finally, we're going to look at what actually stops it, including some really, really controversial science on rehabilitation.
It's going to be a pretty comprehensive map of a very dark terrain. So let's start with the hardware. And this is where I think the average listener might recoil a bit. Because when we start talking about biology and crime in the same sentence, it starts to sound like we're, I don't know, making excuses.
Or worse.
Or worse. Yeah, like we're talking about eugenics or something. So let's just get it out there. Is there a crime gene?
The short answer is no, a definitive no. There is no single gene that you can point to and say, that's the pedophilia gene or that's the rape gene.
So you can't just do a DNA test and find it?
Absolutely not. If you sequenced everyone's DNA, you wouldn't find a scarlet letter stamped on their helix. That is a complete fallacy. However, what the data shows, and this is very robust data, is that there is a heritable liability.
Liability. Okay, unpack that word for me. Is that like a predisposition?
That's exactly it. Think of it like heart disease or maybe alcoholism. You weren't born with a heart attack. You weren't born an alcoholic.
Right.
But you might be born with a genetic structure that handles cholesterol poorly or a liver enzyme that processes alcohol differently. The genetics load the gun, so to speak.
But they don't necessarily pull the trigger.
They do not pull the trigger. They just make it more likely that the gun will go off under certain conditions.
Okay, let's look at the evidence for this because robust data is a big claim. We have this massive study from Sweden in our notes. And I love these Scandinavian studies because they seem to keep records on absolutely everything and everyone.
They do. It's a researcher's dream. The Sweden study is one of the most significant pieces of epidemiological research in this entire field. We are talking about a sample size of 21,566 offenders.
21,000.
And they were convicted between 1973 and 2009. Because Sweden keeps such detailed national registries, the researchers could look at the families of these men. They could look at brothers, fathers, half-brothers, cousins.
And the numbers they found are staggering. I mean, I had to read this table twice to make sure I wasn't misinterpreting it.
They are. They looked at what's called the odds ratio. Basically, if you are a regular person walking down the street, your risk of being a sex offender is baseline. Let's just call it 1.
Okay, that's our control group.
Right. Now, if you take a man who is the full brother of a convicted sex offender, so they share 50% of their DNA and they grew up in the same house.
His odds ratio is 5.1.
5.1.
0.1.
Whoa! So just by virtue of being the brother, you are 5 times more likely to also become an offender compared to a random person.
5 times more likely. And that number, it drops as the amount of shared DNA drops. It's a perfect gradient. For fathers and sons who also share 50% of their DNA, the ratio is 3.7.
A little less, but still very high.
Right. And for half-brothers who only share about 25% of their DNA, it drops down to about 2.1.
That sounds like a pretty clear genetic signal. But I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because I know what you're thinking. They're brothers. They grew up in the same house.
Maybe the dad was abusive. Maybe they lived in a terrible neighborhood. Maybe they both hung out with the same bad crowd. Of course, they both turned out damaged. That's not genes. That's environment.
And that is the classic bad seed versus bad soil argument. And it's the first question everyone asks. It's the right question to ask.
So how do they separate that?
Well, the statistical modeling in this study is incredibly sophisticated. It allowed them to separate nature from nurture. They looked at the variance in liability. What percentage of the risk comes from what source? What they found was that genetic factors accounted for approximately 40% of the variance.
40% is huge. That's nearly half the pie chart right there.
It is a massive slice of the pie. But here is the real shocker, and this is the part that usually floors people when they read this research: the shared environment.
So the stuff they both experience.
Right. The household poverty level, the neighborhood they grew up in, the general parenting style that both siblings experience, that only accounted for 2% of the variance.
Wait, 2%. That seems impossibly low. We're always told it's about the home environment. You hear it all the time. He grew up in a broken home, or he grew up in a rough neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying that statistically that accounts for almost nothing.
It really challenges a lot of long-held sociological theories. But we have to be very careful here. It doesn't mean environment doesn't matter. That's not the takeaway. It just means the shared environment doesn't drive the variance as much as we thought.
So what's the rest of it? What's the other 58%?
The remaining 58% of the variance comes from what they call the non-shared environment.
Okay, you have to help me understand the difference. Shared versus non-shared. What does that mean in practice?
Okay, so think of the shared environment as the wallpaper of the house. It's the stuff that is constant for everyone living there. The address, the income level, 2 parents or 1.
Got it.
The non-shared environment is the specific things that happen only to you. So maybe you were bullied at school and your brother wasn't. Maybe you had a specific traumatic event, a car accident, or, and this is key, a specific instance of victimization that your brother didn't experience. Those unique individual traumas are the 58%. But the general, we grew up poor or we grew up in a bad neighborhood, has very little statistical power compared to the genetic liability in those unique personal traumas.
That is a fundamental shift in how we have to think about this. It's not just where you were planted. It's the seed itself, plus the specific storms that hit that individual stalk.
That's a perfect way to put it. Precisely. And there was another really important nuance in the study about the type of offending, right?
Yes, the phenotype distinction. This was fascinating to me. They didn't just lump all sex offenders together.
Right. And what they found is that this genetic link is phenotype specific. The genetic liability is much, much stronger for child molestation. It's about 46%,
Almost half?
almost half, but it's much lower for adult rape, which is around 19%.
Yeah. So what does that mean? That offending against children has a stronger biological basis than sexual violence against adults. That implies that pedophilia, the actual, the sexual attraction to prepubescent children, is more hardwired.
That is what the data strongly suggests. It implies that pedophilia has a stronger neurodevelopmental underpinning. It's built into the architecture of the brain from very early on.
Whereas adult sexual violence might be, more influenced by other factors.
Exactly. It might be more influenced by social learning, peer attitudes towards women, alcohol, impulsivity, immediate environmental triggers. It suggests we might be dealing with two very different types of monsters, if we want to keep using that word.
Which brings us down to the molecular level.
Yeah.
If there's no single crime gene, what are these genes that make up that 40% liability actually doing? What is the mechanism? You mentioned the MAOA gene in the notes.
Yes, the so-called warrior gene. I have to say, I hate that name.
It sounds like something out of a fantasy novel.
It does. It sounds cool, but it's incredibly misleading. It refers to an enzyme, monoamine oxidase A. Think of this enzyme as the janitor of your brain.
The janitor. Okay, I can picture that.
Your brain runs on neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine. These are the chemicals that make you feel happy, stressed, alert, motivated.
The soup.
The chemical soup, exactly.
Uh-huh.
Once they've done their job, they kind of leave a mess. The MAOA enzyme comes in and it breaks them down, cleans up the spill, so your brain can reset for the next signal.
So if you have the low activity variant of this gene, MAOAL, your janitor is lazy.
Right.
Or just slow.
Exactly. Your brain doesn't break down these chemicals as efficiently, so you end up with this chemical soup that's just kind of simmering all the time, which can make you more reactive, more impulsive.
So you have a baseline chemical imbalance.
You have a vulnerability. And this is the perfect example of that biopsychosocial model we talked about.
Yeah.
Having the MAOAL gene does not make you an offender.
Right.
Let me be clear. Plenty of successful CEOs and athletes have this variant. It acts as a diathesis, a pre-existing vulnerability. The research shows what we call a gene-by-environment interaction.
The collision.
The collision.
Yeah.
If you have this low-activity gene and you are exposed to severe childhood maltreatment, the rates of antisocial behavior and aggression they skyrocket.
So it's the combination. If you have the gene but a happy, stable childhood, you're probably fine.
Generally, yes. You might be a little more hot-headed, but you're fine.
Yeah.
But if you have the gene and you experience significant trauma, your brain is chemically less equipped to handle that trauma. It renders the brain less able to regulate the emotional fallout, which can lead to aggression.
It's like having a car with bad suspension.
That's a great analogy.
On a smooth road, you don't even notice. But if you hit a big pothole, the trauma, you lose control where another car might just bounce and keep going.
Precisely. And that connects directly to the neuroanatomy, the actual structure of the brain. Because we aren't just talking about chemicals floating around, we're talking about actual physical broken breaks.
Okay, so let's get into the brain scans.
Exactly. When we look at MRI and fMRI studies of offenders, we see consistent structural deficits. The two key areas that always pop up are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, or PFC.
Let's break those down for everyone. The amygdala is the alarm system, right? The emotional center, fear, anger.
Right. It handles fear, aggression, and crucially for this topic, processing the emotions of others. In many sexual offenders, we see reduced volume and reduced activity in the amygdala.
What does that translate to in terms of behavior?
It correlates with significant deficits in empathy. If your amygdala isn't firing correctly, you might not recognize or process the distress of a victim in the same way a neurotypical person would. You just don't get that visceral gut punch, stop, I'm hurting them signal.
Feedback loop is broken.
It's broken. And then you have the prefrontal cortex.
The CEO of the brain.
The CEO.
Yeah.
The braking system. It's the part that tells you, I have this urge, but I shouldn't act on it because it's wrong or illegal or dangerous.
And in offenders?
Offenders consistently show lowered activity here. But the most fascinating and I think most disturbing finding comes from DTI scans. Diffusion tensor imaging. It looks at the white matter.
The wiring, the cables connecting the different parts?
Exactly, the connections between the parts. And there is a disconnect. The white matter integrity, the quality of the wiring connecting the emotional centers like the amygdala to the control centers of the frontal lobe is compromised.
So, let me see if I get this. Imagine the CEO is in the office shouting, "Stop the factory, don't do it," but the phone line to the factory floor is cut.
That is a perfect analogy. The engine is revving, the urge is there, the emotion is there, but the wire that sends the signal to the brakes is frayed or cut.
So they might even know it's wrong on some level.
They might cognitively know it's wrong. They can pass a written test on morality, they can tell you the rules, but in the heat of the moment, the neural signal to inhibit the behavior just doesn't get through fast enough or strong enough.
And this brings up a distinction that I found really crucial in the reading. The difference between a non-offending pedophile and an offender. Because that concept, that someone can have the urge and not act, is so important.
It is probably the most important distinction in the entire field. There are men out there who have pedophilic urges. They are genuinely sexually attracted to children, but they never, ever touch a child. They live their whole lives in torment, but they follow the law.
And when you scan their brains...
It's fascinating. They often show high executive control. Their PFC is working overtime. It's lit up like a Christmas tree.
So they have the urge, but they have a superpowered braking system that keeps them in check.
Exactly. A superpowered braking system, often combined with a lot of moral scaffolding and support systems. So the crime happens when you have the urge plus the failure of the inhibition system.
The engine and the broken brake.
It requires both.
Okay, before we move off the hardware completely, we have to mention hormones, because everyone's immediate assumption is, oh, it's high testosterone. They're just hypermasculine beasts.
And that's almost always a myth. It's not usually about super high testosterone levels in adulthood. In fact, some offenders have lower testosterone or issues with their androgen receptors. But the damage, it seems, often happens prenatally.
Before they are even born, while they're in the womb.
Yes. Exposure to androgens, like testosterone, in the womb organizes the brain. It sets up the neural circuitry for life. And there's a really interesting physical marker for this called the 2D.4D finger ratio.
The finger ratio. I'm looking at my hand right now. I have to admit, this always sounds like palm reading to me.
It sounds like pseudoscience, I know, but it's a surprisingly well-replicated biomarker in a lot of fields. You measure the length of the index finger, which is the second digit, or 2D.
Versus the ring finger, the fourth digit, 4D.
Right. A lower ratio, meaning your ring finger is relatively longer than your index finger, indicates higher prenatal testosterone exposure.
And this is more common in offenders.
Sexual offenders, particularly child molesters, often show this lower 2D.4D ratio more prevalently than the general population.
So again, it just points to something happening in the developmental architecture of the brain, long before they ever make a conscious choice.
Right. And I want to be very, very clear about this. Biology is not destiny. None of this is an excuse.
No.
But it is an explanation of the liability. It's the hardware they're working with.
So that's the hardware, the loaded gun. Now let's talk about the software, the environment that pulls the trigger. The biggest concept here, which comes up in almost every paper, is ACE's adverse childhood experiences.
ACEs are basically the standard metric for childhood trauma now. It's a questionnaire about abuse, neglect, household dysfunction like parental substance abuse or domestic violence.
And the research shows a clear dose-response relationship.
Yes, exactly. The higher your APE score, the more cumulative trauma you have, the worse your outcomes are across the board. Health, wealth, happiness.
And for sexual offenders, this score is usually sky high.
It is, especially for juvenile sexual offenders. They report significantly higher rates of physical neglect and sexual abuse than even other types of non-sexual offenders.
And what's the theory there? How does that trauma get converted into this specific kind of offending?
The theory is that this cumulative trauma destroys the ability to self-soothe. If you grow up in constant chaos and fear, you don't learn how to regulate your own emotions.
You don't build those internal muscles.
You don't. So you turn to maladaptive coping mechanisms. For some, that's drugs or alcohol. For others, it becomes sexualized behavior to soothe their anxiety or to feel a sense of control that they never had as a child.
This leads us directly to the cycle of abuse. We hear this phrase constantly, violence begets violence, hurt people hurt people. Is it actually true, or is that just a convenient narrative we tell ourselves?
It is true, but it is heavily, heavily nuanced, and we have to be incredibly careful not to stigmatize victims.
Yes, absolutely.
The vast majority of sexual abuse victims, men and women, do not become offenders. They're survivors. They carry that trauma, but they don't pass it on in that way.
Yeah.
But for a specific subset of males, the risk is very real.
And the data shows a massive gender difference here, which is really striking.
It's huge. Female victims of child sexual abuse are not significantly more likely to become sexual offenders. They might have other struggles, substance abuse, self-harm, depression, but not perpetration.
But Male victims.
Male victims, however, show a distinct and statistically significant increase in risk for becoming perpetrators themselves.
Why? What is the mechanism there? Why is it different from men?
Well, the research identifies 4 specific risk factors that seem to turn a male victim into a potential perpetrator. First is the age of onset.
You'd think earlier would be worse.
You would. And earlier abuse is incredibly damaging to the psyche, absolutely. But abuse that starts later in adolescence, around age 12 or older, is much riskier for this specific outcome.
Why that age? Puberty.
Puberty. If you are hitting puberty and your hormones are raging and your introduction to sexuality is through an abusive experience, it completely warps your sexual script.
It becomes the template.
It becomes the template. You begin to associate arousal with abuse, power, and secrecy. The data is shocking. Boys who were abused after age 12 have a 10% conviction rate for sex offenses later in life.
10%. And what's the rate for non-abused men?
It's 0.6%.
Wow, that is a dramatic increase. What's the second factor?
The second factor is the relationship to the abuser. If it's a trusted figure, a parent, or a beloved coach, it creates profound boundary confusion. Love and abuse become intertwined.
Okay.
Third is force. Male victims are statistically more likely to experience physical force or threats than female victims are. This instills a sense of profound powerlessness and humiliation.
And later in life?
Later in life, the offender might try to flip the script. They want to be the one holding the power, not the victim. It's a twisted pathological reenactment of the trauma where they try to win this time.
It's a way of regaining control.
Exactly. And the fourth, and perhaps the most insidious factor, is grooming and normalization. If the victim experienced physical pleasure during the abuse, which is a purely physiological reaction, it is not consent. Or if they were told the abuse was special or a secret game, they normalize the behavior. They internalize the idea that this is how adults and children interact.
So they aren't necessarily trying to hurt a child in the same way they were hurt. They're repeating a pattern they were taught was love or special attention.
In their twisted cognitive map, yes. They might genuinely believe they are loving the child the way they were loved. And this connects us perfectly to the operating system, the psychology of it. Because you have to ask yourself, how do you live with that? How do you look in the mirror every day?
You need a story. You need what the research calls a permission structure.
Exactly. We call these implicit theories or cognitive distortions. Offenders don't usually walk around thinking, I am an evil villain. They have a whole set of distortions that allow them to function.
And the notes list 3 key ones: entitlement, dangerous world, and uncontrollability.
Right. Entitlement is the core belief that my needs supersede your rights. It's a profoundly narcissistic trait. I want this, so I will take it.
And then dangerous world.
Dangerous world is the idea that the world is hostile and corrupt, so I need to control this child to protect them or teach them about the real world. It reframes the abuse as a form of mentorship.
How twisted.
It's incredibly twisted. And then uncontrollability is the classic, I couldn't help it, the urge was too strong. It removes all personal agency. It's not my fault, it's my biology or it's my addiction.
And specifically for child molesters, there's that other distortion of benefit, right? The idea that the child actually got something positive out of it.
Yes. I was teaching them about love. They enjoyed it. They never said no. I gave them gifts and attention their parents didn't. They minimized the harm down to 0.
Because if they admitted the real damage they were causing,
Their entire ego would collapse. Their self-image would shatter. So the distortion is a survival mechanism for their own psyche.
this psychological framework, it enables the behavior. And the behavior itself isn't random, it's calculated. Let's talk about the process of grooming, because I think most parents worry about the stranger in the bushes, but the research is clear that's almost never how it happens.
It's a complete myth. Grooming is a methodology. This is a process, and it usually happens in plain sight with someone the family knows and trusts. The source material outlines 5 distinct stages.
Okay, let's walk through them. Stage 1, selection.
They don't just grab a random kid from the playground. They hunt for vulnerability. They are experts at spotting the child who is isolated, who has low self-esteem, maybe a child who is neglected at home and is just desperate for any kind of positive attention.
The easy target.
The easy target, which leads to stage 2, access and isolation.
Right, because you can't groom a child with parents hovering around all the time.
Exactly. So they volunteer for roles that grant them unsupervised access. They become the coach, the babysitter, the youth group leader. They offer to drive the kid home from practice. They slowly, methodically create alone time.
And then Stage 3, trust development.
This is where they become the favorite adult.
Yeah.
They buy the gifts the parents won't buy. They listen to the child's problems when the parents are too busy. They build a deep, powerful, emotional bond. The child comes to see them as their special friend, their confidant.
And then comes stage 4, desensitization. This feels like the tipping point. This is where it gets really insidious.
It's the most dangerous stage because they don't just jump from being a friend to committing abuse. They lower the barriers incrementally, bit by bit.
Wow.
It starts with accidental touch, wrestling, tickling, playful pats. Then maybe they show a slightly inappropriate sexual image on their phone or make a dirty joke to see the child's reaction.
You're testing the waters.
They're testing the waters,
Yeah.
normalizing sexual contact. If the child doesn't recoil or tell anyone, they push the line a little further next time, and a little further the time after that,
Until the line is gone.
until the line is completely gone. And finally, you get to stage 5, maintenance.
This is keeping the secret.
This is enforcing the silence. This is our special secret. If you tell anyone, you'll get in trouble too. Your parents will hate you, and they'll blame you. They use the trust they built in stage 3 to weaponize the child's own silence and guilt against them.
It is terrifyingly effective, and it explains why so many cases go unreported for years or even decades. The child feels complicit.
They feel complicit.
Yeah.
It also highlights why the whole stranger danger campaign was so useless. The danger is rarely a stranger. It is the nice guy from down the street who buys the pizza and offers to drive your son home from practice.
Before we get to prevention and what we can do about this, we need to quickly distinguish the types of offenders, because the guy who grooms a child for months is different from the guy who snaps and attacks an adult stranger.
They are very different. The research generally points to 2 main typologies, with a third one emerging. First, you have fixated offenders.
These are the pedophiles.
Yes. Their primary preferential sexual attraction is to children, and it usually starts in their own adolescence. Their behavior is persistent and compulsive.
Okay, and the second type?
The second type is situational or regressed offenders. These men might actually prefer adult partners, but their life falls apart, a divorce, they lose their job, they start drinking heavily, and they regress.
So it's not a primary attraction.
No. They offend against whoever is available and vulnerable in that moment of crisis, which is why this is often where you see cases of incest. They aren't driven by a specific pedophilic orientation, but by stress, opportunity, and a breakdown of their own inhibitions.
And the new category you mentioned, online offenders.
Right, the digital predator. This is a new frontier for research. Some are just contact offenders who are using the web as a tool to groom, but others seem to be exclusively virtual. They collect images, they trade material online, they engage in chat rooms.
And the question is?
The question for researchers is, are they fundamentally different? Or are they just contact offenders who haven't had the opportunity to act in the real world yet? The jury is still out on that.
So we have the hardware, the genetics, and the brain structure. We have the software, the trauma, and the environment. And we have the operating system, the psychological distortions, and the grooming process. Now the big question. How do we stop it?
Prevention is usually divided into 3 levels: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is stopping it before it ever starts.
So things like the 2-adult rule in churches and schools, or bystander training programs like Stop It Now, where adults learn to spot the signs of grooming.
Exactly. It's about changing the environment to make it harder for offenders to operate.
But the real controversy and the really fascinating part of the research is in secondary prevention, specifically the Dunkelfeld model from Germany.
This is fascinating and deeply, deeply ethically complex. Dunkelfeld is German for dark field or dark figure.
Meaning the unreported crime?
The unreported crime, but also the uncommitted crime.
Huh.
The idea is there are men out there who know they're attracted to children, but they haven't offended yet. They're in the dark field.
So the German program, Don't Become a Perpetrator, basically puts out a call to these men and says, come to us. We will give you therapy and total confidentiality. We will help you manage your urges so you don't end up hurting a child and ruining your life.
And in theory, it is brilliant. It's a pure public health approach. Treat the condition before the crime occurs. But the data on the reality of these programs is, well, it's disturbing.
There was a follow-up study mentioned in our notes that just hit me like a ton of bricks.
You're talking about the self-report data, I'm assuming?
Yes. In one study of these programs, 85.7% of the participants admitted to self-reported sexual delinquent behavior during the time they were in the program. Wait, let me just repeat that. They were actively enrolled in the prevention program, and almost 86% of them were offending anyway.
Self-reported behavior, yes.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker, the official recidivism rate. The number who got caught and convicted was 0%.
Zero. Because of the confidentiality clause.
Exactly. Because they were in a medical protected space, they weren't being prosecuted for what they were admitting to their therapists. So statistically, on paper, the program looked like a miracle success, 0 arrests. But in reality, the participants were admitting to behavior that wasn't being stopped by the law.
That is the iatrogenic risk, the idea that the treatment itself might be causing harm.
Or shielding harm. The dilemma is huge. Does this program act as a shield, allowing them to offend while feeling like they're in treatment? Or does focusing so intensely on the urges in therapy actually intensify them for some men?
It's a paradox.
It is. We want them to seek help, but if the help lacks any real accountability, we might be creating a dangerous blind spot in this system.
Which leads us to tertiary prevention, rehabilitation for those who've been caught, what actually works. Because the old school mentality is just lock them up and throw away the key. Nothing works for these guys.
That nothing works mentality is thankfully outdated. We have models that do work with varying degrees of success. The gold standard for decades has been the R&R model: risk, need, responsivity.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's very logical. You match the intensity of the treatment to the risk level of the offender. High risk gets high intensity treatment. You focus on their criminogenic needs, the things that actually drive their offending, like their cognitive distortions or their lack of empathy.
But there's a newer model that's gaining traction called GLM, the Good Lives model.
I find the Good Lives model really interesting because it's strength-based. It's positive. R&R is all about don't do this, stop thinking that. It's about deficits.
It's about stopping the bad things.
Right. GLM flips the script. It says, look, you offended because you were trying to get a primary good. You wanted intimacy or happiness or a sense of mastery, but you went about it in a horrible, destructive, illegal way. Let's work together to help you get those same things in a healthy, pro-social, legal way.
So it treats them like human beings who have legitimate needs, rather than just broken machines that need fixing.
Exactly. And the research shows it improves motivation for treatment significantly. It's much easier to work towards building a good life than to just work towards not getting arrested again.
But for the really high-risk guys, the ones with the biological broken breaks we talked about at the very beginning, is talk therapy really enough? We need to talk about chemical intervention.
We absolutely do. We need to talk about TLM testosterone-lowering medications. It's often called chemical castration in the media, though that term is a bit loaded and inaccurate.
These are drugs like cyproterone acetate or GnRH analogs that essentially shut down the body's testosterone production.
They turn down the volume on the biological drive.
And the stats on this? They're undeniable.
They are stark. A brand new 2024 meta-analysis compared high-risk offenders who received therapy PLS, this medication, versus a matched group who just got therapy alone.
Okay, let's hear the numbers.
For general recidivism, any new crime, it was 27.8% for the Meds Plus therapy group versus 51.9% for the therapy-only group.
Wow, so it cuts the risk almost in half.
Almost in half. But for violent recidivism, it was even more dramatic. 1.9% for the medicated group versus 15.2%.
That's a massive difference in public safety.
It is. And the time to failure, how long they were able to last in the community without reoffending, was almost double for the medicated group, 113 months versus 69 months.
If the data is that strong, why isn't every high-risk sex offender on these medications? It seems like a no-brainer.
Because of civil liberties, cost, and the significant side effects. These are serious drugs. They can cause bone density loss, weight gain, severe depression, metabolic syndrome.
And the legal question.
And the massive legal and bioethical debate. Can you force someone to take a medication that fundamentally alters their body chemistry, even if it makes the community safer? But from a pure public safety standpoint, the data shows that the hardware, the biology matters. If you turn down the engine, the testosterone, the broken brakes, the prefrontal cortex, have much less work to do.
Finally, before we wrap up, we have to talk about COSA, circles of support and accountability, because this model addresses that isolation piece, the non-shared environment.
COSA is a brilliant, community-based model. You take a core member, a high-risk offender getting out of prison with no family or friends, and you surround him with a circle of 3 to 5 volunteers.
Just regular people from the community.
Regular people, teachers, retirees, church members. They meet with him every single week.
You police him to act as parole officers.
No. To support him and hold him accountable. It's both. They help him figure out the bus schedule, practice for a job interview, but they also ask the tough questions. Why were you late tonight? Who were you with? You seem really stressed out. What's going on? They break the cycle of secrecy and isolation.
And the results on this are incredible.
They're stunning. A major study out of Minnesota showed that offenders in COFE had 88% less sexual recidivism compared to a matched control group.
88%. That is almost unbelievable. It shows that social isolation is a massive trigger, and human connection is a massive protector.
It proves that you can't just treat the biology and the psychology in a vacuum. You have to treat the social environment, too. You have to rebuild that healthy community connection.
So let's try to synthesize this whole deep dive. We started with the simple, comfortable idea of monsters. We've ended up with a complex, uncomfortable map that includes genes, brain scans, childhood trauma, cognitive distortions, and profound social isolation.
We moved from a cartoon villain to a complex, probabilistic trajectory. Biology loads the gun, the environment pulls the trigger, psychology aims the weapon.
And because it's a process, because it's a series of steps, it can be interrupted.
That is the hope in all of this. It is not destiny, it's probability. And we can intervene at every single step. We can intervene at the biological level with medication. We can intervene at the environmental level by stopping the cycle of abuse and using programs like COSA. We can intervene at the psychological level with effective cognitive behavioral therapy.
It leaves us with a really provocative thought, though, and this is what I want to leave the listener with as we close.
Go for it.
If we accept the science, if we really truly accept that 40% of the liability is genetic, that the amygdala is physically smaller in some offenders, that the white matter tracks connecting the brakes to the engine are physically disconnected, does our current justice system make any sense at all?
That is the ultimate billion-dollar question, isn't it?
We punish people for moral failures. But if the brakes are physically broken, if it's a hardware failure, is prison the right tool? Or does society need to shift its entire focus from punishment to public health management? If a man is high risk because of his biology, maybe the answer isn't 10 years in a cell and then we just release him and cross our fingers. Maybe the only ethical answer is indefinite medical management, mandatory TLM, mandatory community supervision with COSA forever. Not because we hate him or want to punish him, but because he is dangerous in the same way a contagious virus is dangerous.
Is it ethical to punish a broken brain? Or is it the only truly ethical choice to permanently manage it for the safety of the entire community? That is the question this science forces us to ask.
And on that very heavy note, we are going to sign off. This was a tough one, but thank you for listening. Understanding really is the first step to prevention.
Stay curious.
And stay safe.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.